Roger disappeared without a trace, his car still in the driveway and not a single thing taken from the house. Mr. Whitaker said in a gruff voice. The weight of his words lingered in the air like a distant echo of something forgotten. Wise Laura and I had just moved into a new house in a quiet town, nestled in a new state, far from the suffocating grip of our hyper-religious parents. They hated the idea of us living together unmarried, and their disapproval had turned crazy, leaking our phone number and address to their church members, who bombarded us with calls and letters day and night. It became too much. We scraped together every dollar we could and found what seemed like a miracle, a house for sale at an unbelievable price. The young couple selling it had been unusually pushy, eager to close the deal, but we couldn't pass it up. A fresh start, away from everything we'd left behind, felt like the lifeline we desperately needed. Still, we tried to compromise. Well, I'm not pressuring you to compromise. We could use the money we spent together as a marketing expense for ourselves and the... Now, here we were, having dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, an older couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. They'd invited us over as a gesture of welcome, and we were glad to have someone familiar in this unfamiliar place. Bill was the owner before the young couple you bought from, Mr. Whitaker continued, swirling his wine. They got it cheap, probably because the bank didn't know what to do with it. Roger was gone just like that. Funny though, those kids only lasted about a year before they left too, but I don't judge or pry. He took a long sip of wine, his eyes flicking briefly toward Mrs. Whitaker. She smiled and replied to Mr. Whitaker. Ilara reached for my hand under the table, her grip tightening slightly. Did they ever find out what happened to him? She asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. He shook his head slowly. Nah, never. It was as if he just stopped existing one day. The room felt heavier. Mrs. Whitaker, sensing our unease, spoke up with a soft smile, her tone gentle, as though trying to smooth over the cracks Mr. Whitaker had widened. Oh, love, don't let him scare you. Roger was a strange man, always kept to himself. It's a big world out there. He probably just went back to his hometown or started over somewhere else. Nothing ever happens here. It's a beautiful, quiet town. Their words stayed with us long after we left that evening, even as we thanked them for their hospitality. It was comforting to know someone nearby, but the story lingered in my mind. As the days passed, we settled further into the house, falling deeper in love with its quirks and the freedom it represented. It was the clean slate we had dreamed of. 3 months passed, and life felt easy, refreshing even. But then, one evening, everything changed. We were getting ready for dinner at a little local restaurant we'd affectionately nicknamed Our Spot. I was rifling through the clothes in our bedroom closet, searching for something decent to wear, when I noticed it. A small, faded pale moon door, no taller than 4 feet, stood behind the hanging jackets, as though it had always been there. Its wood was worn and cracked, its paint peeling to reveal darker, older layers beneath. Most of the clues left the area beneath, and the door was worn and cracked, its paint peeling to reveal darker, older layers beneath. My hands froze mid-match neuron. Time seemed to stall as I stared at it, my mind grappling with the sheer impossibility of its presence. It is... And Laura, I called louder than I intended. Baby, come here. She appeared moments later, wrapping her arms around me from behind in a playful hug. What is it? Her words trailed off as she followed my gaze to the door. What the hell? She whispered, stepping closer. We stood there in silence, staring at it. We had been living in this house for months. I had used this closet every day. There was no way we could have missed this. At this moment, the projection halted again, now growing stronger. It's got to lead to storage or something, I said, my voice shaky, trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe a Beha heater? Ilara's face was tight with unease. Finn, no. There's no way we wouldn't have noticed this, even when we first moved in. It wasn't here. I reached out and pulled the door open. It swung silently, its hinges unnervingly smooth. On the other side was a small, dimly lit room, no larger than a child's bedroom. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, its weak glow barely illuminating the space. The walls were plain and gray, with no shelves or furniture, just emptiness. Looks like it's just extra storage, I muttered, unsure even as I said it. Ilara crossed her arms and shrugged, but the tension in her body told me she wasn't convinced. I don't know, Finn. I don't like this. How could we have missed it? We didn't know what to make of it, but as the days passed, it became easier to ignore. The door was just there, a strange, inexplicable feature of the house we tried to dismiss. But a week later, everything changed again. Ilara was at work, and I was home alone, tidying up the bedroom. I reached into the closet to hang a shirt, and my hand froze midair. The door was gone. Instead, the wall behind the clothes was smooth and beige, as though the door had never existed. My heart raced as I pushed the clothes aside, running my hands over the surface. Where is it? I whispered to myself, knocking against the wall in disbelief. The absence of the door felt more unnatural than its presence had. By the time Ilara got home, I had turned to the only thing I could rely on, beer. When she walked through the door, I sat in the kitchen, nursing my third one. Tough day? She teased, dropping her bag by the counter. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, I mumbled, shaking my head. I just have to show you. As I led her down the hallway to our bedroom, her face softened, and curiosity flickered in her expression. But as we reached the middle of the hallway, we both froze. There it was again, the pale blue door, standing where it absolutely should not have been. Its faded paint and cracked wood seemed to mock us. It came to the same thing. It would recover. It would fail no longer. Its faded colors, its black. We exchanged a look, a shared moment of disbelief that we couldn't put into words. Slowly, I turned back to the door. Without waiting, I pulled it open. This time, the door revealed a small study. An old wooden desk sat at the center, a single candle on top casting flickering shadows across the walls. Above, a narrow staircase spiraled upward, lined with bookshelves crammed with hundreds of dusty volumes. Holy, Ilara began. Shit, I finished. Holy, we stood at the threshold, too curious to leave despite our confusion. The room exuded an eerie beauty. The desk, scratched and weathered by time, seemed to whisper stories of the past. The candle's light danced across the room, casting an inviting yet mysterious glow that beckoned us further inside. We were bookworms through and through, and whatever questions we had about the door and its impossibility faded as our love for text took over. Without hesitation, we moved to the shelves, fingers trailing across the worn spines of novels and tomes. The books were familiar, yet different. I pulled out a copy of The Return of the King, the final volume of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and flipped to the ending, eager to relive one of my favorite climactic moments. But instead of Frodo's triumphant destruction of the ring, I found a dark twist. Sauron reclaiming it, plunging Middle-earth into eternal darkness under his reign. My breath caught in my throat. Thunder rose. His true form, reclaiming it, plunging Middle-earth into eternal darkness under his reign. My breath caught in my throat. Ilara, these endings, they're not right. She glanced up from a worn copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, her brow furrowed. You're kidding, she said, though her tone betrayed her disbelief. She flipped through the book, her face growing more unsettled as she read. In this version, Alice never returned home. Instead, she became trapped in Wonderland, the once whimsical world turning dark and cruel as she realized she was part of an endless nightmare. It wasn't just those books. To Kill a Mockingbird ended with the town succumbing to its worst instincts. Atticus ostracized, Scout left alone in a place consumed by hate. Each book we read carried the same unnerving thread, familiar stories twisted into something dark and hopeless. We couldn't explain it. The books looked authentic, and the writing matched the author's voices, but the content wasn't right. Desperate for answers, we took a few of the books to a local bookstore. The owner was intrigued but skeptical, her raised brows suggesting she thought we were playing a prank. It didn't matter. This was the late 80s, and there was no internet to search for answers. As days turned into weeks, the pale blue door became part of our lives. We'd visit the study often, reading the altered books late into the night, our conversations circling back to our differences. The strangeness of it all became our new normal. Until, one day, the house offered something new. While rummaging through the shelves in the study, I discovered a hidden panel behind the desk. Inside was an old withered book with no title or author. Its leather cover was cracked and faded. The book smelled of mildew and age, and as I opened it, I found a collection of dark, grim fairy tales I had never heard of. One story stood out, its words lingering in my mind like a faint echo. That night, as we lay in bed, I read it to Alara. In a realm where reality's edges softly fray, a hidden sanctum veiled by twilight exists. Here, the waters, clear as mirrors, do not reflect the heavens, but a void teeming with whispering stars. Light and darkness perform a delicate ballet of shadows and luminescence, revealing and obscuring truths. Spinning from unseen energies, this domain fluctuates between tranquility and a silent prison, resonating with the cosmic whispers of those drawn to explore its mysteries. The grand observatory above once pierced the celestial veil, its lens aligning mortal fates with the arcane dance of stars and shadowed voids. Below, the mirrors do more than reflect. They capture the very essence of those who dare gaze into them, holding echoes of souls adrift in time and space. As the sanctuary breathes with the quiet sighs of ancient walls, it watches with an unblinking, omniscient gaze. Hidden in the empty spaces, a ravenous entity feeds on the hushed fears and secret desires of those ensnared by its ancient allure. Laura stared at me with wide eyes as I jotted the words down on a scrap of paper. "What do you think it means?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what any of this means. Do you think we should tell someone?" She hesitated, then suggested, "The Whitakers? Maybe they'll believe us, or at least see it with their own eyes." It was a good idea. The following weekend, we invited the Whitakers over for dinner. After a pleasant meal, we gave them a tour of the house, steering them toward the hallway where the door was. Ilara and I exchanged a nervous glance as we approached, but when we turned the corner, we froze. The door wasn't there. All we saw was the plain beige wall, unremarkable and innocuous. Ilara and I tried to mask our shock, plastering on fake smiles as the Whitakers complimented the house. After they left, though, we were at a loss. "The house," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. "It's messing with us." We stayed up late that night, arguing over what to do. Were we going crazy? Was the house truly supernatural? Should we leave? But even as the fear grew, we couldn't deny the house hadn't harmed us. Not yet. Our argument was cut short by a sound, a distorted creak, like a door opening through static. It echoed faintly from the living room. We walked in cautiously, and there it was again, the pale blue door. This time it stood behind the television, its wood faded and cracked, the edges glinting faintly in the dim light. I wish I could say I was scared, but at that moment, I was consumed by curiosity. I moved the TV aside, gripped the handle, and pulled the door open once more. It led to a dark observatory, a room unlike anything I had ever seen. The air felt colder here, sharper. A massive, antique telescope stood at the room's center, surrounded by desks cluttered with star charts and scattered notes. Planets I didn't recognize hung suspended from the ceiling, their surfaces glowing faintly in the moonlight that streamed through the domed windows. "Whoa," Elara murmured, her voice tinged with awe. We explored the room in silence, our unease momentarily replaced by wonder. The telescope, though ancient in design, was shockingly functional. I peered through the lens, expecting familiar constellations, but the stars weren't ours. The sky beyond the telescope was alien, a canvas of unnatural phenomena. A black star pulsed faintly in the distance, its void-like surface swallowing the surrounding light. Nearby, a shattered planet's exposed core glowed with an eerie molten heat, its fractured surface hinting at cataclysmic destruction. Adjacent to this desolation, another planet teemed with life, but not as we know it. Its surface writhed with chaotic, erratic appendages, moving with deliberate, unsettling intent. "Elara," I whispered, stepping back from the telescope. "This isn't our sky." She took her turn at the lens, her breath catching. Our unease grew palpable. Whatever this observatory was intended to reveal, it showed us vistas we were never meant to see. Scenes from a cosmos where the laws of nature were grotesquely twisted. As the reality of these discoveries settled in, the lines between what was real and what was part of the house's mysterious influence blurred. The telescope revealed sights that should have been awe-inspiring, but instead filled me with a sense of smallness, like I was staring at something I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't stop drawing them, charting them out, as if mapping the skies might somehow make sense of it all. One night, while lying awake, the distorted creak of the door returned. This time, it came from our bathroom. I shook Elara awake, and together, we walked to the bathroom. There, embedded in the shower wall, was the pale blue door again, its wood as worn and faded as before. I hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. We stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with a soft, white glow emanating from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Large mirrors lined the walls on either side, their surfaces pristine at first glance. The floor beneath us was cold, reflecting the light like polished obsidian. There was a path forward, leading into the unknown. As we walked, the mirrors began to shift. At first they were normal reflections of ourselves moving through the space, but then they started to change. Some mirrors stretched tall and thin, while others were jagged and cracked. One showed my reflection lagging slightly behind me, like it was struggling to keep up. Another displayed me smiling faintly, only I wasn't smiling. "Elara," I said nervously, my eyes darting to her reflection. But she wasn't beside me in the glass. I turned quickly, relieved to see her still there, but she was frozen, staring into a mirror. "In," she said softly, her voice shaking. "You're not in this one." The longer we walked, the more surreal it became. The mirrors began reflecting impossible things, hallways that didn't exist, and scenes from our childhoods. One mirror showed me as a child, standing alone in a dimly lit room. My heart raced as I approached a particularly distorted mirror at the end of the hallway. There, a cracked mirror lay under a flickering light, casting an uneven, stuttering glow. From a distance, it was hard to make out the details, but a dark, menacing presence seemed to crowd the surface. As I drew closer, I heard a muffled voice. It was mine, coming from the other side of the glass. My own reflection was pressing its face against the mirror, sobbing uncontrollably. Finally, I slid around it, grabbed a hold of the mirror, and pulled myself. "You've got to help us," it sobbed, its voice muffled, yet unmistakably my own. "Elara, are you seeing this?" I said, not taking my eyes off the reflection. When she didn't respond, I turned to her. She was transfixed by a mirror, where her own reflection crouched in the fetal position. "We're trapped in here," her reflection whispered. "It won't let us out." The air grew heavy and thick, with an overwhelming sense of dread. As we backed away, the mirrors around us began to shift again. The reflections weren't ours anymore. They cried, their sobs filling the room, then laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed endlessly. And then, silence. That's when the lights began to go out, one by one, starting from the far end of the hallway. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Alara's hand. We bolted back toward the door, the darkness chasing us, swallowing the mirrors and the path behind us. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, though nothing broke. We stumbled through the door and slammed it shut, gasping for air. "What the fuck is with this house?" I said between breaths. "I don't know," Alara said, her voice trembling, "but I'm starting not to like it. That was too much." The pale blue door stayed in the bathroom for weeks after that. We avoided it by using the guest bathroom instead. It became a symbol of unease, a thing neither of us wanted to confront. The house felt different now, less like a curiosity and more like a trap. We talked about selling it, about leaving everything behind, but we always stopped short of actually making plans. A part of us didn't want to admit how deeply the house had gotten under our skin. And one day, as I was hanging up clothes in our bedroom closet, I froze. There it was again, the pale blue door, standing exactly where we'd first found it. I called for Alara, and she joined me, her expression mirroring my own apprehension. "What do you think it leads to this time?" I asked. "Are you serious?" she replied. "It could be anything. A twisted garden, another world, maybe a theater showing some warped version of movies we love. Who knows?" "Should we open it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Alara bit her lip, her curiosity warring with her fear. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to know as much as I did. Shevkulkor crept closer, and the shadows expanded as they got. "Maybe just a peek," she said finally. I nodded and pulled the door open. It swung silently, as it always did. The room beyond was eerily reminiscent of the first room we had found, but this time there was no ceiling, no walls. The single light bulb lay on the ground, casting a faint, lonely glow. The floor beneath us was like glass, perfectly smooth and reflective. As I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps broke the silence. Splish, slosh, plop. It was like stepping on a shallow puddle, though no water clung to my shoes. Alara followed me, and together we walked into the void. The vibrations from our steps rippled outward, distorting our reflections on the floor. We walked for what felt like hours, the light from the bulb growing fainter with each step. Our curiosity outweighed our fear, and we decided to return the next day better prepared. We planned to tie a rope to an anchor in the closet, and bring a flashlight to see how far we could go. The next day, we hooked up the rope and ventured further into the abyss, holding each other's hands. The flashlight wasn't much use, but it gave us a small sense of security as we continued deeper. Every now and then, we looked back to see the dwindling light from the door, a tiny beacon in the vast darkness. Splish, slosh, blop. The sound of our steps on the wet-sounding floor filled the void. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath, but before I could respond to Alara's inquiry about the size of this place, I turned back toward the door. My heart stopped. The light spilling from the doorway was dimming, shrinking until it vanished completely. The sound of the door closing echoed like a gunshot in the silent expanse, leaving my ears ringing. I froze, paralyzed by fear. Then, without warning, the bulb shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor, plunging us into complete darkness. My flashlight flickered once before dying, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing to fill the void. Then, behind us came a sound. It moved slowly, wetly, like something dragging itself through thick, viscous mud. The squelch of movement sent a chill up my spine, and just as the noise ceased, a deafening splash echoed as though something massive had dropped into the water. Squelch, slosh, plop. "Ilara, run!" I screamed, grabbing her hand. The air behind us grew warmer and more stifling, a sign that something was rapidly closing the distance. Ilara was crawling across the cobblestones, screeching and growling in anger. She skidded to a halt in front of us. We ran, following the rope as best we could. The faint tremors beneath our feet were the only reassurance that we were moving in the right direction. My mind raced, and panic blinded me to everything except the desperate need to escape. "Honey!" The splashing grew erratic and violent, as did whatever it was gained on us. "Jesus Christ, keep going, Ilara!" I screamed, my throat raw. The rope snapped, leaving us directionless momentarily, but we stumbled forward. Then, finally, we slammed into the door. We pushed it open and spilled into the closet. I threw my body weight against the door, desperate to close it, but it wouldn't budge. Something on the other side was pushing back, clawing, fighting to keep it open. A sharp, searing pain shot through my shoulder as its claws tore into me, the heat behind the door unbearable now. Blood ran down my arms, soaking my shirt. "Go back to hell, you fucker!" Ilara screamed, throwing herself against the door to help me. It became a brutal struggle, each side pushing in a horrific tug-of-war for control. The thing clawed at me again, deeper this time, and I screamed, a mix of pain, fear, and raw desperation. Its guttural, animalistic wails echoed through the door. And then, suddenly, the resistance stopped. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the closet. We collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The silence was deafening for a moment, then broken by a loud bang against the other side of the door. Whatever it was still there, throwing itself against the wood, trying to break through. Each impact made the walls tremble. "Ilara, let's go," I said, clutching my bleeding shoulder. She helped me to my feet and we exited the house. That was the last night we ever spent there. We tried everything. We reported a break-in to the police, but when they inspected the house, the door was gone. There was no evidence, no explanation. Frustrated and fearful, we stayed with the Whitakers for a few nights, then in cheap motels, and sometimes even in our car. The thought of burning the house crossed our minds more than once. But something stopped us. Maybe fear. Or guilt. The door became more capricious as the days passed, appearing in unexpected places with growing urgency. It would show up under our bed, on the ceiling, behind mirrors, initially quiet with faint knocking that escalated into loud, desperate banging. The encounters became too frequent, too terrifying to ignore. Eventually, we put the house up for sale. We were young and broke, and the house was all we had. It became harder to justify the truth, even to ourselves. We told the realtor we were relocating and that it was too much of a house for us. And when the offer came, a young couple with a little girl, no older than 6, we accepted. As we emptied the house, the door appeared less and less. The banging and the faint knocking all stopped as we packed, but even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us go. That was years ago. Ilara doesn't talk about it anymore, but it never left me. I've carried the weight of what we did and left behind. A few months ago, I looked up the address on Google Earth. The house is still standing. In the street view image, there's a family unloading boxes, a man and woman, smiling, with 2 kids playing in the yard. If you ever stumble upon a door that seems out of place, a door that leads to realms beyond the grasp of your understanding, to dimensions that twist and shatter reality, don't open it. Some doors are not meant to be opened.